Good morning. Our next session is Can I Actually Use It? Testing Open Textbooks for Accessibility, presented by Tara Robertson and Kendra Levine. Tara Robertson is the Accessibility Librarian at Caper, BC, manages alternate format production of textbooks and other course materials for post-secondary students with print disabilities. She also advocates for students with print disabilities and collaborates with other organizations to improve access to accessible materials. Kendra K. Levine is a research librarian at the Institute of Transportation Studies Library at UC Berkeley. She advocates for open data and open access for all research. She also runs the library at Berkeley's college radio station, KALX, where she's also a DJ. Please join me in welcoming Tara and Kendra.
So good morning. I'd like to acknowledge that we're on the traditional territories of the Mississauga New Credit. This 20-minute talk will cover what open textbooks are, some background information about the project in BC, our user testing process, and the accessibility toolkit that we wrote. And I'm so delighted that Kendra will be providing a live soundtrack of Creative Commons licensed music. So I work at Caper, BC. We're an organization funded directly by the Ministry of Education and Advanced Education in BC. We serve students with print disabilities at 20 post-secondary institutions. Last year we had about 1,200 students, 65% of whom had learning disabilities that impacted their ability to use traditional print. 15% of our students have visual impairments and about 1% are blind. Other kinds of print disabilities include people with physical disabilities who can't hold a book, or maybe people with head injuries who can't sit and focus their eyes on the page or on the screen. So the service we provide is a disability accommodation. This means that students have to be registered with their disability service office, have gone through an ed psych assessment, which costs about $2,000. And with this assessment, the disability service counselors then determine what kind of accommodations are necessary. In the case of students with print disabilities, we're format shifting print textbooks to be digital files that they can use with assistive technology. We're allowed to do this under the Canadian Copyright Act. So each semester, students submit their requests for the books that they're going to need. Right now, it's our busiest time, and if students are submitting their requests now, they're going to need to wait about 3 weeks to get the files. So they'll be 3 weeks behind students who don't have print disabilities. So when I heard about the Open Textbook Project in BC, I was super excited. I saw an opportunity for us to insert ourselves at the beginning of the publishing process with content creators to make content accessible from the beginning instead of waiting till the end to fix things that are broken. So open textbooks are a way to significantly reduce student textbook costs while giving instructors the flexibility to reformat and customize their course material. They're an affordable, flexible alternative to traditionally published materials. The key part of this definition is that they're available under an open copyright license. So as you can see from this graph, the consumer price index for textbooks has gone up about 816% in the last 30 years. 816% in 30 years. That's disgusting. Economists would characterize this as a principal-agent dilemma, as the instructor who's selecting the textbook isn't the person who has to pay for it. As Kwantlen professor and open textbook faculty fellow, Dr. Rajiv Jaggiani says, open education is a social justice issue. According to a study done by US PIRG, 65% of students have not purchased a textbook for a course because of the price. So this is me in library school. I managed through all of my courses by using library copies of books, sharing one copy of a book with a group of classmates, using an outdated edition, not doing the reading, or scanning the entire book and then returning it to the bookstore. I know I'm not the only one. So the question is, how often do students start the term without the resources that they actually need? The goals of the BC Open Textbook Project are to increase access to higher education by making it more affordable. For some students, textbook costs can be another financial barrier to education. The second goal is to give faculty more control and power over the learning resources that they use in the classroom. Because open textbooks have a Creative Commons license that allows for the book to be modified, instructors can tailor the textbook to fit the course instead of modifying their course to fit the textbook. Third, we want to make open and open education more widely known to educators, and an open textbook project is a very straightforward way to do this. Textbooks are a familiar tool in post-secondary education, and it's fairly easy for most people to understand open education through open textbooks. This project started in BC in October 2012, so we're coming up to the 3-year mark. BC Campus was the organization that was asked to create a collection of open textbooks that was aligned with the 40 highest enrolled subject areas in the province. A second phase was announced last spring to add 20 textbooks targeting skills training and trades. So the first step was to create a catalog of high-quality open textbooks that were created elsewhere. BC faculty reviewed these books, and some of them were adapted for the BC context. So yesterday, the 100th title was added to this collection. And to date, there have been 24 new textbooks written in BC, 9 adaptations, and 5 ancillary resource projects, like test banks, created. So we've also been developing software to help support the adaptation and creation process of open textbooks. In BC, we're using a tool called Pressbooks, which is an open source book creation plugin for WordPress. Pressbooks allows authors to create the content once and then publish to a number of different formats, including EPUB, PDF, and HTML. Hugh McGuire from Montreal, who presented at Access in 2012, is the founder of Pressbooks. So to date, this project has saved BC students from $600,000 to $822,000. In his keynote at the Open Textbook Summit, Dr. Rajiv Jhangiani said, "We need to be very aware of the messaging about who higher education is reserved for. If we don't think about accessibility, who are we saying belongs in higher education? And if our students can't afford the textbooks, who are we saying belongs?" So for this project, I worked with 2 amazing instructional designers, Amanda Coolidge from BC Campus and Sue Donner from Camosun College. None of us had done any user testing before. Our goal was to get about 15 students to test the open textbooks. In the end, 7 students completed the written feedback, and 5 of those students attended an in-person focus group. They received a $150 honorarium. So we selected a good cross-section of content and known accessibility issues. For the English literature book, there were poetry and footnotes. The psychology book, there were tables and undescribed images. The sociology book had a section quiz and was 1 long chapter without any headings. BC in a Global Context is a geography book. It had charts, maps, and an embedded Google map. And the chemistry book had images, formulas, and equations. The 5 different subject areas didn't necessarily line up with what our student testers were studying. We gave them the following instructions. What we're asking you to do is read 1 chapter from 5 different textbooks in the way that you normally would, using the software and hardware that you would normally use. We realize some of these topics may be outside the area that you're studying. For each chapter, there were a few questions about the content that were intended to test the readability of the content, not the person's intelligence. So don't feel bad if you have a tough time answering these questions. For each chapter, please fill out the feedback form and note any areas where the content was hard to understand. It is likely you will get content that is not accessible or not very accessible. So for each chapter, we thought up some content-related questions, like what is the definition of Weber's law and what's the population of Sweden? That we hope that would make the testing a bit more realistic and give some focus to the students reading these chapters. So here's a photo from our in-person focus group. And as facilitators, we were pretty nervous about doing this focus group. It was our first experience with user testing and working with a group of students in person who were blind or visually impaired. 5 students attended the focus group, and while they all have visual impairments, they were all using different assistive technology, including VoiceOver on an iPad, VoiceOver on a Mac, JAWS on Windows, ZoomText on Windows, and Kurzweil on Windows. They were from 3 different universities and had different majors, including general arts, English, computer science, business, and an occupational therapist who's doing a PhD. Amanda, the person sitting right in the middle beside the person with the toque, did a really fantastic job of facilitating that day. She did a great job of not making assumptions about what students were experiencing or what the problem was. Instead, she asked the students for more detail or to show us what wasn't working. The students highlighted some accessibility issues that we hadn't anticipated. For example, in the English book, there were some embedded YouTube videos that JAWS skipped over entirely. And we didn't anticipate that the section quiz questions and answers in the sociology book were going to be so confusing. There were about 10 multiple choice questions, and the answers were at the very end of the chapter after the endnotes. No one knew they were there because they lacked a heading. Also, a vertical pipe was used as a delimiter between each question. VoiceOver reads a vertical pipe as vertical line, and JAWS reads it as vertical. So it sounded like 1A vertical line, 2B vertical line, 3C vertical line, and 4D vertical line, which is really confusing. So I'm going to show you a video of what the student with ZoomText was seeing. So ZoomText is software used by people with visual impairments. You can change the color scheme, style of the pointer, and enlarge things on the screen. So we didn't anticipate that when poetry was enlarged using ZoomText that it could be super annoying to have to scroll horizontally to read the end of the line. This formatting issue clearly gets in the way of being able to read and feel the flow of the poem. So I didn't understand what the student wrote on her feedback form, but when she showed me this, the problem was clear. So we wanted to summarize what we had learned and combine that with existing standards like WCAG 2.0 and ARIA markup. We wanted to explain to content creators why they should care and illustrate to them clearly how to make their content accessible. So we launched the Accessibility Toolkit at February of this year, and it's written on the same Pressbook platform that the other open textbooks use. It's also a CC BY license, so if you can use any of this content in your work, please feel free to repurpose it and reuse it. So there's two main sections in the Accessibility Toolkit: key concepts and best practices. Universal design for learning is the first key concept. So using the principles of universal design for learning, course materials are proactively designed to support types of learning styles and learner preferences. For example, visual aids can be an effective way of explaining a concept to some learners, while providing a text version of the same concept may be the learning preference for others. Planning at the design pre-delivery stage for the multiple methods of accessing course concept is one of the fundamentals of Universal Design for Learning, or UDL. So this is very different from a disability accommodation. Disability accommodation is for a specific individual student who has a diagnosis, is registered with disability services, and it's not proactive. Like I said, for students submitting their requests for alternate formats now, they're going to have to wait about 3 weeks. So for user personas, we adapted the user personas that Sarah Horton and Whitney Queensbury used in their book, A Web for Everyone, Designing Accessible User Experiences. And we adapted them to better reflect the student demographics in BC. For me, this was the first time that it was really exciting to work in the open. I was really inspired and humbled when people like Sarah and Whitney allowed us to reuse and remix their work. So there's a common framework for the best practices chapters. We wanted to provide in plain English how to make different types of content, like tables or images or formulas, accessible. So for each chapter, we didn't want to assume that people knew what the specific content type was. So there's what is a table and things to consider before you begin. The who are you doing this for lists different kinds of users who would benefit from this work, and then includes 1 or 2 of the user personas from the beginning, kind of going back to that piece describing who the different people with disabilities could be who'd be accessing this content. And then what do you need to do is a practical, plain English how-to. We're in the process of adding checklists to this section, or to the how-tos for each chapter. And this toolkit's in the process of being incorporated into the development of all new open textbooks in BC. Our Caper BC's Ontario partner Arrow has done a French translation for us, which will be available online in late October. That was also really exciting to have colleagues translate our work and make it more usable. We're doing a second round of user testing in January with trade students who have learning disabilities and the new open trades modules. A Universal Design for Learning community of practices started in BC, and we're working with OCAD's Flow project and a US nonprofit called CAST at Open Education to do an accessibility focus, I guess. So while I've been talking about open textbooks, I think a lot of these ideas are really applicable to libraries in general. So here are my 3 takeaways. User testing is invaluable, and including people with disabilities in your user testing is also really important. And I think thinking about universal design and designing better systems from the beginning is better than retrofitting stuff at the end. So I'd also like to adapt what Dr. Rajiv Jagiani said and relate it to libraries. So when students with disabilities can't access information through your library's website, catalog, databases, or repositories, what are we saying about who belongs? And what are we saying about who gets to access information? This is definitely a social justice issue. I'd like to thank Brian Lamb and Dr. Jones, who did a similar style of presentation that I saw in BC and that inspired this presentation. And here's the track listing. Thank you. and that was 19 minutes. So if you've got any questions, maybe tweeting them at us is the best way so we stay on time. Thanks.
She said tweet it to her.
Oh, tweet already?
Do we have time? We're at 20 minutes now. Okay.
One of the issues about getting our faculty to adopt open textbooks is they complain that short of writing the textbook themselves, the quality isn't there. Can you talk about the quality of these textbooks?
I was involved in the accessibility stuff for this project, but I know a little bit about this. So when they weren't trying to recreate the wheel, they were looking at high quality textbooks that had produced elsewhere, and they incentivized BC faculty to review the books. I think they paid $400 per review. So if the quality wasn't there, people said that. And I know Dr. Rajiv Javiani uses open textbooks in his class, and says the quality, the quality is on par with, I guess, traditionally published textbooks, and it also gives him the freedom to modify the content that he's using in his class rather than teaching to the textbook and the test bank that the publishers provided.
We have room for one more question if anyone wants to ask a question.
Nice creepy music, Kendra.
I'd be curious, just personally, because of the kind of work I do, about authoring tools for open textbooks, because it's part of what I work on in my job, which is building authoring tools for more accessible open textbooks. Like, are there gaps or limitations right now in what exists to make authoring these useful, and where would we need to fill those in to make it kind of almost, have an authoring tool that makes things accessible by default? Along with some combination of guidelines of what people should be doing, but just don't use things that produce inaccessible tables, for example.
I think some of it's the platform and some of it's the content. In BC, they're adapting Pressbooks to include the toolbar that Flow has produced that kind of sits at the top of the web page, where you can change the color contrast, you can change the font size. I don't know, it's your tool. What else does it do? Cool. There's, I think, math accessibility and accessibility of math formulas is sort of the trickiest technical point in terms of technology and content. There's been huge advances, I guess, in the last year, where screen readers, the three big ones being JAWS for Windows, NVDA, which is the open source one, and VoiceOver on Mac, can read MathML properly. And each of them needs a slightly different output of MathML. So thinking about that in terms of what you're going to upload to a WordPress instance and the way it's going to output in different formats and be accessible to those three different screen readers is tricky, and there's a lot of moving parts. But at least now there's consensus that MathML is the way to go, and screen readers are becoming able to read that content, which is tricky because I think for math scholars and math publishers, LaTeX has been the way they've published. Cool. Thanks for the creepy music, Kendra. Thanks.